Komodo Dragon. Picture the largest lizard on Earth, a predator that can take down a deer, and then imagine it producing offspring without a single male involved. That's exactly what Komodo dragons do. And it was confirmed in 2 separate zoos in the early 2000s when females that had never been near a male suddenly laid fertile eggs. The process is called parthenogenesis, which basically means the female's unfertilized eggs develop into embryos on their own without being fertilized by sperm. What makes Komodo parthenogenesis particularly strange is the chromosome mechanics behind it. Female Komodos carry WZ sex chromosomes. When an egg develops on its own, it can only produce WW or ZZ offspring. And WW embryos don't survive, so every single virgin-born Komodo dragon comes out male. That means a female, completely isolated, can produce sons who then grow up to mate with her and restart a conventional population. It's a built-in survival mechanism for isolated individuals, likely evolved because Komodos colonized remote islands where a single female washing ashore could theoretically start an entire population from scratch. The offspring are fully viable and grow into functional adults capable of their own reproduction down the line. That's not just weird, that's one of the most practical reproductive strategies in the animal kingdom. Marbled crayfish. This species didn't exist before the mid-90s, and the story of how it appeared reads like science fiction. Somewhere around 1995, a single mutant crayfish turned up in the German pet trade. And what made it extraordinary was that it carried 3 sets of chromosomes instead of the usual 2, a condition called triploidy. That extra set of chromosomes made it entirely female and entirely capable of reproducing without males through a process called apomixis, where eggs develop into embryos without fertilization and without even the chromosome shuffling that happens in typical parthenogenesis. Every marbled crayfish alive today is a genetic clone of that one original animal. And here's where it gets alarming. People released them into the wild, and they've since spread across Europe, Africa, and parts of Asia. A single clonal species born from one individual less than 30 years ago is now established on 3 continents. Each one can produce up to 200 offspring at a time, and because they're all genetically identical, there was no founder population, no gradual spread. It was just one animal, then thousands, then millions. Because no males are needed and every individual can reproduce, the population grows at a rate that sexually reproducing species simply can't match. That's the real power of this reproductive strategy, and it's exactly why this little crayfish has been so impossible to contain. Bdelloid Rotifer. There are animals that occasionally skip sexual reproduction, and then there's this microscopic creature that abandoned it entirely around 80 million years ago and never looked back. Bdelloid rotifers are a class of tiny aquatic invertebrates, and in all the time scientists have studied them, not a single male has ever been found. Not one. The entire class reproduces exclusively through parthenogenesis, where females produce eggs that develop into new females without any fertilization taking place. What makes bdelloids particularly compelling is that they've survived this long without the genetic diversity that sexual reproduction normally provides, which conventional evolutionary theory says should doom an asexual species over time. The likely explanation is something called horizontal gene transfer, where these animals absorb and incorporate DNA from bacteria, fungi, and plants directly from their environment, essentially replacing the genetic mixing that sex would have provided. This means the absence of males hasn't left them genetically stagnant. They found a completely different mechanism to generate variation, one that doesn't require another individual at all. Their eggs require no sperm to develop, no hormonal trigger, and no external signal of any kind. The female simply produces offspring that are functional copies of herself, generation after generation, for what amounts to geological timescales. Whiptail Lizard. Out in the deserts of the American Southwest, there are lizard species where you will never, ever find a male, because none exist. Several species of whiptail lizard are entirely female, every individual, every generation, with reproduction happening through parthenogenesis, where unfertilized eggs develop into full offspring without fertilization. But here's the part that makes biologists do a double take. These all-female species still perform mating behaviors with each other. One female will mount another, mimicking the role of a male. And this physical stimulation actually serves a biological purpose. It triggers hormonal changes that increase the number of eggs the mounted female produces. The behavior alternates between individuals depending on where each lizard is in her hormonal cycle. So even in a world without males, the behavioral cues that evolved alongside sexual reproduction are still being used, just repurposed entirely. These species are also hybrids, most of them descended from two different sexually reproducing parent species that interbred and produced offspring with an incompatible chromosome count for normal sexual reproduction, making parthenogenesis the only viable path forward. The eggs develop through a process where chromosomes double before cell division, producing offspring with a complete and functional set of genetic material entirely from the mother. Some of these all-female lineages have persisted for hundreds of thousands of years, which is remarkable for any asexual species. A shark giving birth without a male involved sounds like something out of a documentary you'd assume was exaggerating, but it happened, and it was verified by DNA evidence. In 2001, a female bonnethead shark, a small hammerhead relative, at an Omaha zoo, gave birth despite having been housed exclusively with other females for 3 years. Scientists initially suspected stored sperm, since some sharks are capable of retaining sperm from a previous encounter for extended periods. But DNA testing on the pup ruled that out completely. The offspring had no paternal DNA whatsoever, it's making it the first scientifically confirmed case of asexual reproduction in any shark species. The mechanism behind it involves the egg retaining a polar body, which is a cell that would normally be discarded during egg maturation, and that retained cell essentially acts as a substitute for sperm, triggering the egg to begin developing into an embryo. The pup was unfortunately killed by a stingray shortly after birth, but the biological conformation was already documented. Since then, parthenogenesis has been recorded in other shark species, including zebra sharks and great hammerheads, mostly in females kept away from males for extended periods. The capacity appears to be present across multiple shark lineages, sitting dormant until conditions make it the only available reproductive option. If you're finding this as wild as I am, I post content like this regularly. It would mean a lot if you subscribed. Thanks. Brahminy blind snake. The world's most widely distributed terrestrial snake is one most people have never heard of, partly because it looks exactly like an earthworm. The Brahminy blind snake is tiny, shiny, and almost entirely harmless, but what it lacks in intimidation, it makes up for in reproductive strategy. This species is entirely female, where unfertilized eggs develop on their own and hatch into daughters that are genetic copies of the mother. What's remarkable is how far from this strategy has taken them geographically. Brahminy blind snakes have been documented on every tropical and subtropical continent on Earth. And the leading theory for how they spread so widely is accidental transport through the international plant trade. A single female stowing away in a pot of soil is all it takes to establish a new population, because she doesn't need a mate. She is, by herself, a complete founding population. Every individual alive across Asia, Africa, Australia, the Americas, and various island chains is believed to descend from a single ancestral female whose eggs required no sperm to develop. The species is triploid, carrying 3 sets of chromosomes, which stabilizes the asexual reproductive process and allows it to produce viable offspring consistently across generations. No other terrestrial snake has colonized the globe quite so effectively, and the secret is simply that every single individual can reproduce. Aphid Colonies. Most animals that can reproduce asexually do it occasionally under specific conditions, but aphids built their entire life strategy around it. For the majority of the year, spring through summer, aphid populations consist almost entirely of females reproducing through a process called viviparous parthenogenesis, meaning they give birth to live young rather than laying eggs, and those young develop without fertilization. But the truly jaw-dropping part is what's called telescoping generations. A female aphid is born already carrying developing embryos inside her, and those embryos contain their own developing embryos inside them. So when an aphid is born, she's already a mother and a grandmother simultaneously. Under ideal conditions, a single aphid can produce up to 80 offspring per week, and those offspring begin reproducing almost immediately after birth, all without a single male involved in the process. Then, as autumn approaches and conditions deteriorate, something switches in the population. Females begin producing males, sexual reproduction occurs, and fertilized eggs are laid to survive the winter. The eggs hatch in spring as females, and the clonal cycle starts all over again. It's a dual-mode system that maximizes population growth during favorable conditions through male-free reproduction, then preserves genetic flexibility when survival pressure increases. The ability to toggle between these two reproductive modes, depending on environmental cues, is one of the most sophisticated reproductive strategies found in any insect. Copperhead Snake. Unlike most documented cases of parthenogenesis in reptiles, which tend to occur in captive animals isolated from males, copperhead snakes have been confirmed reproducing asexually in the wild, and that changes what the phenomenon means biologically. A study published in 2010 documented multiple litters of copperhead offspring that were produced through parthenogenesis by wild females that had access to males. In other words, these snakes weren't defaulting to asexual reproduction out of necessity. Their biology activated it even when sexual reproduction was a viable option sitting right next to them. The mechanism involves polar body retention during egg maturation, where a cell that would normally be expelled is kept inside the egg and provides the chromosomal contribution that sperm would otherwise supply. Offspring produced this way are almost always female and carry reduced genetic diversity compared to sexually produced siblings, which affects immune function and long-term adaptability. Researchers believe the capacity for parthenogenesis may be far more widespread among snakes than the documented cases suggest, with many species retaining the biological machinery to reproduce without males, even if they rarely or never use it under normal circumstances. The copperhead cases suggest this isn't a quirk of captivity or stress, but a genuine reproductive option that wild snakes exercise. What triggers the switch in wild populations, and how frequently it actually occurs, is still an active area of research. Water flea. Daphnia, commonly called the water flea, is a tiny crustacean that has turned reproductive flexibility into a survival strategy that's hard to argue with. During spring and summer, when food is plentiful and conditions are stable, populations are almost entirely female, reproducing clonally through parthenogenesis, where unfertilized eggs develop into genetically identical daughters. The female produces these eggs internally, they develop without fertilization, and the resulting offspring are functional clones, ready to reproduce almost immediately after birth. But when environmental conditions change, when temperatures drop, or resources become scarce, something shifts. The females begin producing males, and sexual reproduction kicks in, generating genetically diverse offspring through normal fertilization. The fertilized eggs that result are encased in a tough protective shell called an ephipium, and they can survive being frozen, dried out, or pass through the gut of a bird and still hatch years or even decades later when conditions improve. The entire system is essentially a biological hedge: reproduce without males as fast as possible during good times, then switch to sexual reproduction to generate hardier offspring when survival gets difficult. What's particularly striking is that the trigger for producing males in the first place comes from the females themselves. When population density rises or resources drop, the females sense the shift and begin generating the males needed for the next phase, making them the architects of their own reproductive strategy from start to finish. Turkey genetics. Domestic turkeys are probably the last animal most people would connect to asexual reproduction, but they've been producing offspring without males at a documented rate for decades. The phenomenon is called facultative parthenogenesis, meaning these animals are capable of reproducing without males but don't exclusively rely on it. And in some domestic turkey breeds, unfertilized eggs develop into viable embryos at rates as high as 40% under certain conditions. The egg's own cellular machinery triggers development through a spontaneous doubling of chromosomes inside the egg, producing an embryo with a full genetic complement sourced entirely from the mother and no sperm involved at any point. Almost all offspring produced this way are male, which is the opposite of what you see in most other parthenogenetic species. And it comes down to turkey sex chromosome biology, where the doubled chromosome combination that survives reliably produces males rather than females. This has been studied consistently since the 1950s, with researchers selectively breeding lines of turkeys specifically to understand how and why the rate of parthenogenesis varies between individuals. Some females produce parthenogenetic offspring far more frequently than others, suggesting there's a genetic component to how readily the eggs begin developing without fertilization. For an animal most associated with holiday dinners, the reproductive biology is genuinely strange, and the fact that it happens spontaneously and measurably in a common domesticated bird suggests the capacity for reproducing without males is hiding in more species than we've thought to look. If this sparked your curiosity about the stranger corners of the animal kingdom, consider subscribing so you don't miss future content like this. Thanks for watching.